As Black as Resistance, Chapter 2. What Lands on Us? Through enslavement in the Americas and histories of indigeneity and migration on the African continent, Black identity is in many ways inextricably linked to land. Most African people can be understood as being indigenous to Africa to the extent that their origins are exclusively from the African continent. Indigenous, however, is usually applied to members of groups and communities comprising nations within and predating larger nation-states, and lands of indigenous nations do not correspond to lands enclosed by international borders. Indigenous communities in Africa, including the Twa peoples scattered across the African Great Lakes, Zambia, and western Uganda, the Maasai and Samburu people of Kenya and Tanzania, the Nuba people of Sudan, the Khoi and the San of southern and southeastern Africa, and the Dogon of Mali and Burkina Faso, and many others. As these different peoples experience marginalization from the state, many have sought to establish their sovereignty and protect their individual and collective rights through state mechanisms, transnational bodies, e.g. the African Union's African Commission on Human and People's Rights and the Indigenous Peoples of Africa Coordinating Committee, and international means, e.g. the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. Prior to the disruption and erosion of African societal structures through colonial incorporation into global capitalism, many of the continent's societies revolved around land-based and pastoral communalism. They were collectively oriented and based on the idea of community ownership. Through the forced extraction of Africans during the transatlantic slave trade, Blackness has come to symbolize a kind of rootlessness. This mass kidnapping and genocidal trafficking forced the reconstruction of enslaved people's ethnic and cultural identities outside of the lands from which they were stolen. To ensure a cohesive, unified anti-colonial struggle and liberation, ethnic identities were deprioritized in favor of newly rendered national identities. The establishment of a British settler colony in what is now Zimbabwe, for example, saw the consolidation of and drawing of colonial boundaries around Mashonaland and Matabeleland, which were declared British protectorates in 1891. One function of these borders, unforeseen by colonizers, was unifying national identity around which indigenous people within those boundaries could unite. In the words of nationalist leader Joshua Nkomo, following the delineation of boundaries previously disputed and defined only by indigenous custom, there was, quote, no reason why all of us should not unite and develop an unquestioned national identity. In 1977, soon-to-be Zimbabwean Prime Minister and later President, Robert Mugabe articulated a similar sentiment, though from a different ethnic position than Nkomo, in Ndebele, naturalizing an essential Shona quality within an apparently historically existent Shona nation. Zimbabwean national identity, however, has never been in question or uncontested, and class, gender, urban, rural divisions in competition, and ethnopolitics continue to fragment notions of, quote, national unity and shape the contours of national politics. The formation differed depending on the state and the colonial processes within it, and the constructed myth of national identity, a pre-existing unified ideological or political subject that could quickly be mobilized against colonial rule, prevailed in Zimbabwe and other African states. Much of the identity production of Black people in the United States, both from descendants of enslaved Africans, African Americans, and otherwise, has stemmed from a sense of yearning, an attempt to reconcile diasporic self with roots and a sense of African groundedness, a sense of home space. Certain strains of Black nationalist thought and politics historically and even presently have called for Black people in America to, quote, go back to Africa. This nationalism, driven by logics of land-based reparations for expropriated labor in the United States and abduction from the continent, voids the sovereignty of African states. Black nationalism in the United States can sometimes entail these quasi-settler claims to land, whether through Black Zionist traditions or land-based reparations claims entailing the establishment of a Black nation within former Confederate states. Black Zionism invoked the Exodus story of Moses leading the Israelites out of bondage from Egypt and into the Promised Land, a clear analogy to the Black diaspora's potential liberation from the subjugation of American white supremacy. Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa politics, for example, emulated the Zionist conception of Aliyah, the return immigration of Jewish refugees in the diaspora to Israel. While a tenet of Zionism, it was not established as large-scale until the late 19th century and then on an even greater scale after Israel's creation in 1948. By contrast, Palestinian refugees displaced by the Nakba, or Six-Day War, are not afforded the right of return granted to them under international law. Founded in 1968, the Secessionist Republic of New Africa was an organization and social movement founded on the basis of three major goals. Leaders sought the creation of an independent black nation in the southeastern states, the former Confederate States of America, a nation that would include Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana, $7 billion in financial reparations to black American descendants of enslaved people, and a nationwide referendum for all African Americans to vote on whether or not they wish to remain U.S. citizens. More controversial than black secessionism itself is the question of the fate of Native American communities in those states. Where would their struggle for liberation and autonomous nationhood fit within the Republic of New Africa framework? Would their sovereignty be erased and subsumed? Settler colonialism refers to the process through which an external force colonizes a space through the establishment of permanent settlements with the aim of permanently securing their hold on specific locales through a claim of special sovereign change or dominion over a space. The kind of colonialism that marked the majority of the world was one that necessitated the existence of indigenous communities for a labor force, among other things. By contrast, settler colonialism is a far more invasive mode of colonialism that is marked by the dispensability of indigenous communities. It is a, quote, project whose dominant feature is not exploitation but a replacement, driven by a ruling logic of a, quote, sustained institutional tendency to eliminate the indigenous population. Settler invasion is a structure, not an event, Patrick Wolf critically notes. Examples of settler colonies include the United States, Canada, Australia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Israel. The creation of each of these states was predicated upon the displacement and removal of long-standing native communities that existed within the borders of the nation-states. Because Africans were forcibly removed from the continent and trafficked into the United States and did not largely participate in the European process of domination, with, of course, notable exception made for the so-called Buffalo Soldiers, African American Army regiments that participated in the Indian Wars, black people cannot be considered as settlers in the United States. Though we may participate in ongoing settler processes and ultimately benefit from the elimination of indigenous people and the expropriation of their land, we are not settlers. But championing the creation of a black majoritarian nation-state where the fate of indigenous people is ambiguous at best is an idea rooted in settler logic. Is settler adjacency what a truly intersectional framework and multifaceted approach to black liberation entails? If we use the creation of the State of Israel as an example, the ultimate reparation for the historical violence is the opportunity to become a colonizer and gain proximity to or entrance to whiteness. Although popularly positioned as a kind of reparation for the mass murder of millions of Jewish people in the German Holocaust, the creation of Israel was an act of European anti-Semitism in the eyes of some, including Israeli scholar Ilan Pappé. The establishment of Jewish homeland meant the antagonistic Western governments, states such as United States and Allied powers that were aware of genocidal violence of Adolf Hitler's final solution, but stood idly by and even sought to appease the Nazi government, would not have to receive as many Jewish refugees. Mirroring this in the United States, white supremacists have historically supported the separatist politics of the Nation of Islam. They have seen black separatism as analogous to white nationalist self-determining politic of white majoritarian United States. Of course, these logics of racial self-determination do not operate the same in reverse. Their endorsement of black separatism is not support for black liberation, but rather an understanding that the self-segregation of the black community means less labor will be needed to remove racial impurity, non-whites, and the actualization of their fully white ethno-state. Richard Spencer recently articulated his identity as a self-proclaimed white Zionist, stating, "I want us to have a secure homeland for us and ourselves, just like you want a secure homeland in Israel." This represents a shared logic of colonization. See, for example, the way the white Ashkenazi Jewish minority comprise Israel's power structure, and an ideological alignment between Zionism and U.S. white nationalism. Israeli state politics revolve ultimately around the removal and subjugation of the Palestinian people, beginning with the Nakba. The continuation of settler colonial development in Israel has translated into land expropriation, housing demolition, construction of settlements, contravening international law, ghettoization, and disproportionate state violence against Palestinians. In Letters to Palestine, Writers Response to War and Occupation, Robin D.G. Kelly describes the ways in which this liberatory thought is not only a narrative of slavery, emancipation, and renewal, but with a language to critique America's racist state, since the biblical Israel represented a new beginning. Unfortunately, though, much of Black Zionist thought recreates the logic of settler colonial entitlements rather than building an incisive and critical foundation upon which to critique settler colonialism and build/repair Afro-diasporic relationships outside of that model. If land-based reparations were to be actualized for Black people in the United States, models for land-based liberation that are not both mindful and critical of settler colonialism would perpetuate the expropriation of land from indigenous communities still fighting to assert their sovereignties. Black American land politics cannot simply be built on top of centuries-old exterminatory settler logic of indigenous removal and genocide. Rather, the actualization of truly liberated land can only come through dialogue and the co-conspiratorial work with Native communities and a shared understanding of land use outside of capitalistic models of ownership. Black land politics are also crucial in understanding the threats posed by climate change resulting from capitalism's ethos of growth for the sake of growth and extraction for the sake of accumulation. The incessant need to extract resources is not limited to the United States or to capitalism, though the United States leads this particular fray. There is nothing too sacred to be consumed or too rare to leave untouched. The natural world is being treated as an infinite pool of supplies, as if resources were immediately replaceable and the degradation reversible. In the meantime, the reigning capitalists have already begun searching for new lands to retreat to and colonize because they know that their economic system is headed towards destruction. This will occur first in the global south. Resources will be expended until there is nothing left to take. Fresh water shortages, deforestation, and dangerous expansion of industry threaten food supplies the world over. Inevitably, resource scarcity and the demise of agriculture will lead to conflicts of increasing scale. When all is said and done, we cannot eat diamonds, gold, coltan, or oil. Competition over remaining resources is already causing conflicts which, given their locations in the global south, are infuriatingly treated by many people as natural or inherent to the populations residing in these regions. The planet cannot sustain a violent system, relentlessly demanding more and more consumption. Claudia von Werhoff notes, under our system, anything subject to natural limitations appears as inherently scarce. Capitalism is insatiable, and needs more than nature has, and needs infinitely more. Hence, anything subject to natural limitations, scarce in the system's terms, and moreover anything which is an indispensable precondition as a means of production for further production, must, in an economic system such as ours, not only be under some kind of control, but be brought under monopolistic control. Those of us who are treated as natural commodities, particularly Black people, and more particularly the wombs of cisgender Black women, must see our inextricable link to the environment. Land-based politics grounded in a sustained and nurturing relationship with the natural world and in protecting nature is a means of protecting ourselves. If humanity continues on its trajectory of environmental degradation, the destruction of countless animal species, including our own, is inevitable. Afro-descended people have historically been compared to simians. One can identify the very black lament that we have been treated like animals, whether in the cages of the carceral state or within white supremacist America writ large. We are commodified and transformed into something over which white supremacy is able to assert authority and claim ownership. In the not-too-distant past, zoos sometimes displayed African people as if they were something less than human, if not less than animal, if not less than both. Displayed as a kind of social and biological oddity, Oda Benga, a Mbuti pygmy from what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, was purchased from slave traders and eventually displayed in the Monkey House at the Bronx Zoo in 1906. We still do not fit the white human default projected into our psyches through the news, public education, pop culture, and virtually all other media we digest within white supremacist society. Climate change and its ravages are not waiting for us to fix our patterns of destructive behavior. We are the only ones who can stop our own causal actions, and this will require more than just words. The responsibility for reversing the harm humans have caused to the environment does not rest with the oppressed peoples of the world who have contributed to it least. Yet the responsible parties refuse to mobilize resources to mitigate the havoc they have wreaked. With that said, our work to end the deterioration of nature must be understood as a necessary and inseparable component of a global anti-capitalist movement. What we have come to know as environmentalism in the United States and the Western world is entrenched in the saviorism inherent to whiteness, but the most critical environmental politics and frontline resistors to climate change emerge from communities in the Global South, particularly indigenous communities. These communities in the Global South and those most oppressed in the Global North have become the primary victims of climate change. In line with oppressive victim blaming, Western capitalists blame environmental problems on overpopulation and resource consumption by poor Black and brown people. Rather than reevaluating the pace of resource extraction and unsustainable environmental practices, they resort to the sinister logic of Malthusianism. In the name of family planning and empowering third-world women, environmentalists often seek to curb the growing populations of the Global South, despite clear evidence that industrialized Western states are largely responsible for global environmental damage. In ecofeminism, Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva assert that industrialization, technological progress, and the affluent lifestyle of the developed nations have precipitated the acceleration of environmental degradation worldwide can no longer be ignored. The main threats are 1. Degradation of land, for example, desertification, salination, loss of arable land. 2. Deforestation, mainly of tropical forests. 3. Climate change due to destruction of the ozone layer. And 4. Global warming, due mainly to increasing rates of carbon dioxide and other gaseous emissions. But instead of looking into the root causes of these threats, which it is feared are approaching catastrophic thresholds, they are today almost universally attributed to a single cause: population growth. Not only the affluent North and dominant political and economic interests, but UN organizations also subscribe to this view. The culturally imperialist and patriarchal view Mies and Shiva describe assert itself in the lives of the people already subjugated globally by whims of capitalism. By furthering the intention of racialized domination of women in their bodies, capitalist systems are able to maintain white supremacist patriarchy for their own social, political, and economic gain, while also evading responsibility for the harm they cause. Mies and Shiva continue, population growth is not a cause of the environmental crisis, but one aspect of it, and both are related to resource alienation and destruction of livelihoods, first by colonialism and then continued by northern-imposed models of maldevelopment. What is also ignored in this carrying capacity discourse is a history of colonial intervention into people's reproductive behavior. This intervention was initially motivated, as in Europe, by the need for more disposable labor freed from subsistence activities and forced to work productively on plantations, farms, roads, and mines, and so on for the benefit of foreign capital. Mies and Shiva determined that it might then well be more fruitful to directly address the roots of the problem, the exploitative world market system which produces poverty. Giving people rights and access to resources so that they can generate sustainable livelihoods is the only solution to environmental destruction and the population growth that accompanies it. When we think of the hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons, and all the different forces of nature that we have destroyed our communities and taken people's lives, we should be inspired to counter all racial capitalist forces that exacerbate natural disaster, from climate change to the racist nature of emergency response. In stormy weather, Katrina and the politics of disposability, Henry Thoreau describes the moral failure of George W. Bush administration in responding to the hurricane's aftermath. He knows how the botched relief effort prolonged the suffering of already vulnerable New Orleans residents and made evident the clear prioritization of certain human lives over others, and how the city became a petri dish for the forces of neoliberalism. From the images of survival theft, or looting, and Black abandonment in the Superdome to the presence of Blackwater contractors providing property protection to the wealthy residents who were able to evacuate, the new era of disposability was made chillingly apparent. Thoreau writes, as Hurricane Katrina vividly illustrated, the decline of the social state, along with the rise of massive inequality, increasingly bar whole populations from the rights and guarantees according to the fully fledged citizens of the Republic, who are increasingly rendered disposable and left to fend for themselves in the face of natural or human-made disasters. This last challenge is difficult, for here we must connect the painful dots between crisis in the Gulf Coast and that other Gulf crisis in the Middle East. We must connect the dots between images of U.S. soldiers standing next to tortured Iraqis forced to assume the additional indignity of a dog leash to images of bloated bodies floating in the toxic waters that overwhelmed New Orleans city streets after 5 long days of punctuated government indifference to the suffering of some of its citizen populations. This system was not designed for us, it was built on top of us.
Our destruction is built into it, but our liberation can be built from its downfall. It is here that finding the resilience of anti-capitalist politics in ourselves and applying them to nature and the environment will guide us naturally. We are not in need of a perfect sectarian model of how to accomplish the building of new anti-capitalist communities. That much will be worked out on individual basis according to when, where, and who is building. What we need now is to educate ourselves and our communities to the point that this common goal is understood. Saidiya Hartman writes in The Terrible Beauty of the Slum, "Better the fields and the shotgun houses and the dusty towns and the interminable cycle of credit and debt, better this than black anarchy." The slum, the ghetto, the reservation, the internment camp, and other class and racialized zones of non-being have all been used as spaces within which non-white life has been relegated and regulated within American necropolitical structures. Necropolitics describes the capacity of the state to dictate who lives and who dies, who is understood as having a right or claim to life, and who is relegated to inhumanity and social death. Achille Mbembe asks, but under what practical conditions is the right to kill, to allow to live, or to expose to death exercised? Who is the subject of this right? Every space inhabited by blackness, particularly black people living on society's margins, is a space to which black life is relegated to die, a space that is visible but is impossible to understand and even offensive to the sensibilities of white people. Urban spaces previously deemed dangerous and unlivable by white people have suddenly become desirable through urbanization, movement within and between cities, and the continuation of settler enclosure. As a result, these spaces are undergoing cataclysmic changes. Waves of gentrification are displacing black people from these spaces and into more affordable areas. Black working class existence is becoming increasingly suburbanized, and this can be attributed at least in part to broader indirect processes caused by exclusionary mechanisms such as the decreasing accessibility and affordability of inner urban neighborhoods, that is, gentrification. The violence of gentrification mimics other violent displacements of capitalism. It is not a new form of colonization, but rather a continuation of settler colonial dispossession in an urban setting. With race and class demographic shifts in urban spaces, there is an accompanying shift in the nature of policing as the state seeks to protect incoming residents who tend to be of higher socioeconomic status than those comprising long-existing communities. Neighborly tensions are buffered by the state. The San Francisco-based anti-eviction mapping project used 311 calls for non-emergency services as one means of measuring these interactions within San Francisco neighborhoods. A study it conducted indicated a steep increase in 311 calls between 2009 and 2014, particularly in the city's most heavily gentrified areas. According to the study, over half of all 311 calls were about public passageway cleaning or graffiti. Of more than 1,311 calls, 402,184 were about street and sidewalk cleaning. 109,999 were for graffiti on public property and 94,619 for graffiti on private property. These are distinct relationships between gentrification and social cleansing, clear correlations between the entry of new residents into urban spaces and corresponding politics of the pricing out and displacement of long-existing residents and communities, and the removal of undesirable aesthetics and behaviors through, for example, imposed restrictions on loitering and noise. While it is impossible to know exactly who is making calls and about what, from well-documented patterns of gentrification and the frequently hostile relationships between new residents and long-term residents, we can reasonably infer that many of these calls about are made by these relatively affluent new residents offended by the visual blight of homelessness, houselessness, and vandalism, though much of the urban graffiti, in fact, consists of both new and long-standing mural projects. These calls comprise what is referred to as order-maintaining policing, the intervention and suppression of behavior that threatens to be offensive, that threatens to disturb the public peace, or that comes from conflicts among individuals that are public in nature. According to the broken windows theory of policing, first introduced by criminologists James Q. Wilson and George L. Kelling in 1982, at the community level, disorder and crime are usually inextricably linked in a kind of developmental sequence. Social psychologists and police officers tend to agree that if a window in a building is broken and is left unrepaired, all the rest of the windows will soon be broken. This is as true in nice neighborhoods as in rundown ones. Window breaking does not necessarily occur on a large scale because some areas are inhabited by determined window breakers, whereas others are populated by window lovers. Rather, one unrepaired broken window is a signal that no one cares, and so breaking more windows costs nothing. These literally and figuratively broken windows signal the impending breakdown of a community in question, that a stable neighborhood of families who care for their homes, mind each other's children, and confidently frown on unwanted intruders can change in a few years or even a few months to an inhospitable and frightening jungle. Never mind that the abandonment of buildings and the degradation of urban infrastructure is frequently a result of municipal neglect or the migration or shutdown of urban industries. According to broken windows logic, it is necessary to maintain order through a hyper-surveillance and regulation of seemingly deteriorating areas, which just so happen to be predominantly poorer communities and communities of color. Order is accordingly maintained by arresting criminals, though this often translates into the state arresting and filling jails and prisons with low-level nonviolent offenders and punishing people for their poverty and precarity. Homelessness is criminalized through laws prohibiting loitering or sitting, eating, sleeping, or panhandling in public spaces. White supremacist hierarchies have long established notions of order, humanity, and citizenship. The formation of systems of mass incarceration saw the maintenance of the system of black slavery despite formal emancipation in 1865. The 13th Amendment of the Constitution declares neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The critical point, of course, is the permission of slavery as punishment for a crime. The state is constitutionally permitted to use incarcerated people for labor or proximate to slavery, which drives the criminalization of non-white and economically disenfranchised people as so-called threats to public safety. Within these racialized hierarchies, criminality is marked with the same coding as slave captivity, such that in essence, blackness is enveloped in such distinctions. Through the inextricable linkage of racialized deviance to black servitude, whiteness becomes deputized against those who do not magnetize bullets. White people are not simply those the state protects and serves. White people are themselves a part of the policing structure, and the notion of public safety cannot be separated from this deep complicity and investment in this form of state violence. This punitive approach to policing and public protection is a precedent that long predates the Clinton administration's euphemistic tough-on-crime policy framework, a social cleansing framework built on the targeting the re-enslavement of black offenders. There is little empirical research indicating the efficacy of broken windows policing, but there is increasing research pointing to the spuriousness of the theory, namely in its conflation of causation and correlation by linking disordered public spaces and the existence of crime. On the relationship between policing patterns and the societally held racist biases about criminality, Dorothy Roberts writes, "One of the main tests in American culture for distinguishing law-abiding from lawless people is the race. Many, if not most, Americans believe that black people are prone to violence and make race-based assessments of the danger posed by strangers they encounter. The myth of black criminality is part of a belief system deeply embedded in American culture that is premised on the superiority of whites and inferiority of blacks. Psychological studies show a substantially greater rate of error and cross-racial identifications when the witness is white and the suspect is black. White witnesses disproportionately misidentify blacks because they expect to see black criminals. To understand geographies of white supremacy, to understand how white supremacy organizes itself across space and through time, it is to understand race and the process through which abstract notions of difference are made material. Anti-blackness is not simply ideological or a personally held opinion about the inferiority of black people. It is also structural processes through which resources are unevenly distributed, which in turn affirms the material realities of black communities, often those of deprivation. These spatial stratifications inevitably affect health, as a lack of access to high-quality foods drives incidences of nutrition-related illnesses like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and malnourishment, and a lack of access to medical care has led to an increase in black maternal and infant mortality rates. Stratification also affects educational outcomes and physical safety due to the nature of policing. A notion of effective black resistance must revolve at least partly around strategies such as resource pooling and community defense, given the state's refusal to provide adequate resources to black people. To collectively respond to these geographies of white supremacy effectively requires us to first understand ongoing processes of settler colonial displacement through gentrification and racial capitalism's hoarding and inequitable distribution of resources. This allows us to understand community health and its relationship to local environmental conditions, shaped by political decisions, changing demographics, and so on. Developing this wide analysis, particularly in understanding how local politics are inextricably linked to global processes, allows us to connect with other struggles and political allies across class, ethnicity, and other lines of identity. Attempting to reclaim and repurpose a settler state will not lead to liberation, and it will not provide the kind of urgent material relief so many people desperately need, though electing empathetic officials sometimes can arguably mitigate against harm. Only through a material disruption of these geographies, through the cultivation of black autonomy, can black liberation begin to be actualized.